us have discovered L'Arche because of the writings of Henri Nouwen. This Dutch priest and theologian famously left behind his successful teaching career to join the L'Arche Daybreak community in Toronto. He lived in this L'Arche community with people that I am now fortunate enough to call friends, and among them is Carolyn Whitney-Brown. To people like Carolyn, Henri Nouwen was part neighbor, part friend, part priest, but always Henry. But even for those people who knew him and his eccentricities, it may have come as a surprise that he became fast friends with the Flying Rodleys, a traveling trapeze troupe. Henry traveled with them, fascinated by the art of trapeze, as much as the friends who taught him about flying through the air. He was so fascinated that Henry's last manuscript was not about the theology and vulnerability for which he's famous. His final writings are about this art of the flying trapeze. So our guest this evening picked up where Henri Nouwen left off at his death in 1996. Carolyn Whitney-Brown earned a PhD in literature and knew Henri Nouwen well. She works now as a professor, author, and illustrator, and thankfully for us, is still a mighty champion of L'Arche. Carolyn, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We will take your questions when we get a little deeper into the hour, and you can ask those questions as they come to you in the chat feature of Zoom. But Carolyn, I wanted to start off with you and find out, how did you find out about this manuscript, how it existed, and how did you come to write this book?
Well, we knew that Henri, of course, we knew living with him at Daybreak that he was practically obsessed with the Flying Rodleys, his new friends. And we knew he wanted to write about it. And we knew he talked a lot about a book. And when he died, he left fragments of it. And in 2017, I think, his estate, the Henri Nouwen Society Legacy Trust, approached me and said, this has been sitting in the archives. Nobody knows what to do with it. It's not really a book, but we don't know what to do. You're creative. Have a go at it. So I, being a scholar, I trotted off to the archives and read everything I could. And they were right. It wasn't a book, but it was really intriguing. And I got really fascinated with the question about why didn't he write his book?
So you knew the manuscript existed and that it was about this flying trapeze troupe. How did you refer to it? When did you know it? You knew it existed out there somewhere, and you're just kind of like, oh, that? Or was it something that you were eager to get your hands on?
Oh, I was curious. I thought from what he'd said that there would be a lot more of it, actually. Manuscript. There were 2 chapters that he had tried to write. I knew when he was alive, we talked about this, that he wanted to write something really different, that he wanted to tell a story, that he wanted to write fiction or creative nonfiction, or just something to tell a story, not a series of spiritual lessons, not things he'd already figured out, but he wanted to really get readers on the inside of an experience he'd had. And so he wanted to write something like he'd never written before. So that I knew. And I knew that he'd published bits of a journal he'd kept when he traveled with them. And I knew that he'd bought a couple of books about writing creative nonfiction. So I knew that he was going to try to write something really different. So I already knew that, but I didn't know what that was until I went to the archives and read it. And truthfully, it was less than I thought it would be. The manuscript only covered his first week of getting to know the Flying Rodleys. And then there was this journal that he'd already published pieces of about when he traveled with them. And beyond that, it was other journal entries published or unpublished in different things, interviews, a film he did. It was just beyond that, I just started to look for, what's the story here? What's the what happened?
So when you got to the manuscript and you found that it was just pretty meager, did you react like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? Or what was your thought process to be able to like move from where you found the manuscript to take it to an actual published work?
It was, well, as I read it and thought about the pieces of it, it became really more and more clear that I couldn't tell what this, I don't know what Henry's story would have been, like what his book was going to be. And I think he didn't write it because he didn't know either. But as I thought about it, I just really loved the story of Henry himself trying to write this book. In fact, I explain in the acknowledgements, I think that I went in some despair actually to my friend Ruth Rakoff, who's a fantastic writer herself, and said, I don't know what to do. Henry's life is stranger than fiction. It's great. He like when he has his first heart attack, he gets taken out a window. And I mean, how weird is that? And it fits the story about the flying Rodleys, but there's not a story here. There's not a book here. I don't know what to do with all these fragments. And Ruth said, well, frame it with that. That's great. Have him going out a window and reflecting back over his life while he's rescued, true story, while he's being rescued out a window during his first heart attack. And then she said with real excitement, she said, did he die when he got to the ground? And I said, no, he didn't die for 5 days. And she said, can you make him die? And I said, no, I can't do that. The book actually adheres really closely to what's true. And for people who are a bit scholarly like me, it has masses of footnotes so you can find out where I got all my ideas. Yeah.
Was that must have been pretty daunting to know that you were going to have to create a story around the meager facts that you had and then to footnote it to the nth degree. Were you worried about how this book would be received?
I felt a lot better after Henry's brother Laurent loved the book. That was really important to me because in a way I'm inventing a character named Henry, right? I'm trying to guess what might have gone on in his head. I'm making up things. I'm conflating and pulling together things that he might not have ever thought of, of how his marching in Selma with Martin Luther King Jr. connects to L'Arche, and he never put those things together that way, and I'm putting them together in a way that makes sense to me. I'm taking an unpublished thing early on in his L'Arche or before L'Arche, where he's watching TV with his dad and he's watching Tina Turner perform on one channel and a Bach concert on another channel. And I take that fascinating channel flipping experience and I connect that to why he gets interested in the trapeze later. So I'm making connections that he never made, hoping that people who knew him better than I and who loved him would find the Henry that I create feels true to Henry. So especially when his brother said that I had really brought Henry back to him, that meant the world to me.
Yeah. I imagine that is a compliment in the highest order. You do a masterful job, I think, of integrating Henry's words and his at least I know to be as a fan of his work, his philosophy on life and vulnerability into this world of the trapeze. Did that come easily for you? And if so, why?
Well, it's just so intrinsic to Henry's thinking, right? There's vulnerability, but there's also competence. I mean, what interests him about the trapeze is the constant risk, the nonstop vulnerability, but confidence all at once. And you're going to fall, you're going to fail. So there's a way in which that's so intrinsic to the whole physical, visual performance that grabs him so much.
So we've got some video of the Flying Rodleys. This is the traveling trapeze troupe that Henri Nouwen followed around Europe. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind reading a little bit of your work while we watch the Flying Rodleys at their work.
I would love to.
Great.
So what you're seeing here is the actual performance that the Flying Rodleys were doing in 1991. So this is the performance that Henri would have been watching. And what I'm going to read was he does a tape that he sends back to Canada to his secretary, Connie, to transcribe. And in the tape, you can just feel his enthusiasm. He's gotten to know them a little bit. It's just a few days into that, and he's just babbling with excitement. And he says, what really got me, what really fascinated me was the trapeze artists. And that's why I became so involved in the circus. And when I saw them at the very beginning, it was absolutely fascinating. This was a group of 5 trapeze artists, 4 of them people from South Africa and 1 an American. I was just so impressed by this group that I kept thinking about them. They did incredible things in the air, and somehow, and that was important that I realized that has always been why I went to the circus. It was never for the animals, never really for the clowns, but what I was always waiting for, what really grabbed me, was the trapeze artists. And these guys were really amazing. The way they were moving freely in the air and making these incredible jumps and catching each other, 3 men and 2 women. And I was just fascinated by their physical prowess. But I was as much fascinated by the group as a team, the way they worked together, because I realized there must be enormous intimacy among these people. When everything is so dependent on cooperation, when everything is so dependent on mutual trust, and everything is dependent on exact timing, I realized from the very beginning that this group has to be really well together. And I saw they enjoyed it, that they really had fun doing it. And there was a kind of excitement in them that became very contagious for me. It was a kind of wow, and I must confess that when I saw them, they seemed to be in a way like gods, so far that I wouldn't even dare to come close to them. I had this emotional response. These people are really so far above me in their talent or in their giftedness. They're such great artists. Who am I? A tiny little guy wanting to get to know them. It seemed impossible for me to ever imagine myself knowing these people personally. I realized how strong that feeling was. It was like, awesome, awesome. And there was something in me more than just a feeling of a fan. It was as if these guys are indeed living in heaven. They're living in the air and I'm on the ground. I was so fascinated by my own emotional response to them that I wasn't at all comfortable to go and talk to them. When he saw the trapeze again, he says though he got all excited the way they walked right in there and they climbed up to the top of the net and made these enormous jumps, and the music and their whole style, they're smiling at each other, the fun they had and their timing and the whole thing. I just couldn't believe they were doing it.
What do you think we should learn from that? What do you think, in knowing you knew Henri and had a relationship and a friendship with him, and many of us know him as someone who invites us into deeper levels of vulnerability and intimacy. What do you make of all of it?
One of the things that totally grabs me here is that he loves that they're having fun. We talk about vulnerability, we talk about community, but what grabs him here that strikes me as really different than some of his other stuff is that they're having fun together, and the enthusiasm, the excitement. And I think, community, the things we try to do together in this world to make the world better, if it's not fun, it's not going to be sustainable. And that's, it's a L'Arche thing, right? That L'Arche, it's not always fun. Don't get me wrong. I lived in L'Arche for 7 years. I know that it's not always fun, but in a way, if it's not fun, there's nothing that'll hold us. Somewhere deep down, there's a fun, there's an enthusiasm, there's an excitement, there's a kind of energy of being together. And that's what I hear in Henri's excitement, that he's catching, weirdly, with people who are superb physically. He's catching something that grips the same kind of excitement in him as L'Arche did, of a community that has this energy between people.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about your time in L'Arche, what drew you to L'Arche, and how you met Henri?
Well, I'd been reading Henri's work since the 70s. I first read him in Sojourners magazine and then started reading his books. I was a teenager and part of a group of young, mainly InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, United Church of Canada, people we were trying to figure out how to live the Gospels. We were trying to figure out how to live community. We were trying to figure out how to live well on this planet, in this world together. Yeah. And Henri seemed to address that really deeply. And I loved right from the start the way Henri takes a question and just digs it deeper. So it was years later, I was finishing a doctorate. My husband and I were realizing that we were having fantasies about what we wanted to do when we retired from academic careers, and we hadn't started our academic careers yet. And we figured that maybe if we were fantasizing about retiring before we'd started, maybe we were on the wrong path. So we went to visit L'Arche Daybreak in Toronto, and then kept visiting. And then a couple of years later, moved there and lived there for 7 years, had 3 children in those years. Yeah, lived L'Arche for 7 years.
So did I have
L'Arche, I just want to say too that maybe people on this call will understand that L'Arche really is, Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. Like once L'Arche is in your heart, you won't ever quite leave. When L'Arche calls, you'll say yes. It'll shape you forever.
So what is it about that you think spoke to Henri? As someone who was alongside him when he lived in community, did I have it right? Was he part friend, part priest, part neighbor, or was it this pursuit of something deeper?
Often I think people assume that L'Arche really kind of came out of nowhere in Henri's life. Because he hadn't really experienced people with disabilities in that kind of a way before. But it's not true. His interest in community, in solidarity, in what we can do together that we can't do alone was with him right through his whole life. Yeah. I remember when John Deere, the writer, peace activist, published the fantastic collection of Henri's writing called The Road to Peace. I had never read Henri's description of going to Selma to a march with Martin Luther King Jr. And of course I hadn't. It was in Dutch. John had it translated. And it totally fascinated me because you could feel right there in the 1960s, Henri's desire for community, his courage in just walking into a situation that's so foreign to him, but his physical longing to be part of something and his willingness to go without needing to be a leader, just to go and experience something because he's hungry for something, because he has a desire and he just follows his heart and gives it a try. And when I read that, and his experience of eating, walking, singing, sleeping badly, making it all happen, it made sense of his L'Arche thing that I just thought, all his life, he's trying out these moments of living the gospel in extraordinary ways with other people who in a way are more experienced in how to do it than he is. And when he goes to L'Arche, you get the same kind of thing happening.
Yeah, there's this sense of when I'm reflecting on what the passage you read from the book, there's this sense of belonging that is woven in there that, I wonder if that was a theme throughout his life of always trying to find out where he belongs in a given situation.
Yeah, and what's great in that passage I read is that he describes himself as this little guy, and these people are like gods above him in heaven. And of course, he is taught at Yale and Harvard. He has 30 whatever books in print. Like, he's not a little guy at all, but in that context, he's I don't know if I'd describe Henri as a particularly humble person, but he certainly was willing to be a learner, to not have to be the expert. He was curious about people. He wanted to find out the world from their view. He was always open to hearing what someone else was experiencing.
So Carolyn Whitney-Brown is our guest tonight. If you just joined us, welcome. We will take your questions later on in the hour. And if you have questions as they pop up, feel free to type them into the Zoom chat for us, and we'll collect those questions and ask them as they come up. So I've got to go back to the origin of the book again and wonder, as someone who lived and worked and considered Henry a friend, what was it like to engage his words after so long after his death?
I gotta say, it made me miss him in a whole new way. I kept
How's that?
finding things that I thought, oh, we could have talked about this, or I wish I could ask him what he meant here, and just the kind of sweet energy of him kind of all came back to me in a new way. One of the things that threw the book into focus for me was, and it's the way I start the book actually, was Rodley Stevens, who's the leader of the Flying Rodleys, wrote a memoir about Henry, which is unpublished, but it's really fascinating. And I used a lot of it with Rodley's permission in the book, so I could see Henry from the outside as well as his own experience from the inside. But what had really grabbed me is Rodley described going to Henry's funeral, and that one of the really famous speakers talking about Henry talked about him as wounded and anguished, and his inner turmoil, and Rodley says he had to just like hold himself back because he wanted to run up to the front of the church and interrupt to describe, that they knew a different Henry. They knew Henry who was relaxed and funny and flamboyant and playful and not anguished all the time, not in turmoil. And when I read Rodley's description there, it kind of helped me, because I realized that something had been niggling at me for quite a while, that a lot of the discussion of Henry and biographies of him after his death have really focused about what is definitely true of him, that he was a very demanding friend, that his inner turmoil was intense, that he really struggled with all kinds of levels of insecurity and anguish. This is all true, but it was harder to get a handle, I think, for people on how to name the delight of Henry, the fun of Henry, Henry's vast enthusiasm for things, Henry's ability to throw himself into what was happening with such zest. And so when this book gave me a chance to kind of revisit that side of Henry, because that's what the trapeze really pulled out of him. And I really enjoyed that. It reminded me of Henry with my children. It reminded me of playful times with Henry. Yeah.
What was he like with your children?
Oh, he loved them and they loved him. He would come over for dinner and he'd fling himself on the floor because he wanted to see what it looked like from the angle of our crawling children. Like I remember he'd go over and stick his hand underneath our cheap IKEA couch because that's what they were looking at, and he was curious what it looked like underneath because that's what they were seeing. Like he really wanted to see the world through other people's eyes. And I remember when our daughter Monica was really obsessed with his giant nostrils and nose, and Henry just took off his glasses and let her stick her fingers up his nose. I mean, he was really very, very generous. He also had a very big nose, so I imagine from a child's view, it was a pretty good view. He was playful.
That's great. There's an image, folks, that you can hang on to of Henri Nouwen. There's this tension between freedom and vulnerability that I think that you bring out really, really effectively in the book. What do you think this book says about that, especially in this hyper polarized world we live in at this moment?
I listened in on a Zoom seminar with John Deere, who I was mentioning before, and a friend of his a few weeks ago named Kazu Haga, who's a peace activist. And Haga said that that nonviolence requires, and this is the phrase that just grabs me, an unwavering commitment to interdependence. And that's interdependence with everybody, whether you agree with them, whether you disagree with them, whether they make sense to you, whether they don't. And it's not just people, it's all of creation And I think I mean, there's a vulnerability to claiming that interdependence that none of us are going to get through alone. And we can't cut out the people who we find unpleasant or difficult or scary. I mean, Henry found nonverbal Adam very scary. He talks about trying to walk into his room at L'Arche, of going into this room and waking up this stranger. It was very scary for him. I mean, there's all sorts of people that we find scary physically, emotionally, politically, and we keep hanging on to this unwavering commitment to interdependence. And the trapeze is an image of that. That no one's going to fly by themselves. You got to have a catcher. And you're going to fail. You're going to fall.
Right.
And when you fall and fail, you're going to do that in full public view. Everyone's going to see it. And then you'll just get up in full public view and climb up that ladder and do the act again and see if you can do it right the next time. And afterwards, you're going to talk about it as your team. I think Henry was just fascinated by that. They would just talk about it without a lot of recrimination, just, how do we get it right next time? And Roundley made a big point of saying, I can't blame people and say you messed up, or they won't have any confidence next time. I need to say, what do we need to do? How can we help? Now let's go out and let's do a perfect act this next time. So there was this sort of constant confidence in each other, constant forgiveness, just absolute acceptance that you're going to fall and fail. And for Henry, that was huge. He was so afraid. Yeah. I mean, there was this point in the book when he watches Carolyn, one of the performers, fall in public, and she just in performance, and she just, actually, I'll read it to you. Can I read it to you? It's just so good.
Please.
He just, she just climbs right back up the ladder, and she does the act again and does it perfectly the next time. But he says, after that, I could hardly watch anymore. I knew that the woman I had met for a few seconds at the concession stand was all right, but I was suddenly confronted with the other side of this air ballet, not simply the dangers of physical harm, but the experience of failure, shame, guilt, frustration, and anger. I mean, Henry's in total knots. She just carries on. But he's tied in knots about it. And I think there's a whole growth for him through watching them just fail and carry on.
It's the other interesting thing I think that you bring up in the book is these instances where Henry, in his own words, said he acted out of fear instead of some other emotion, whether that's the March in Selma, being more vocal on HIV and AIDS work. What do you think he's calling us to even now in this nexus where fear, vulnerability, and strength all blend together, and why is now the moment for it?
Yeah, it's funny, when I had to write a description of the book for I forget whether it was for I think it was for the blurb that HarperCollins was going to post for the book, right? And I kind of enthusiastically wrote about, that we should all let go and fly and not be afraid to fall, right? And you can still find that in some places. But after that had been posted for a few weeks, I thought, you know what? Henry never, ever says that. He never says, don't be afraid to fall, ever. In fact, he says that we're afraid all the time. He says, do I dare do stuff even when I'm afraid? So I actually, wherever I could, corrected it to even when we're afraid of falling, which felt much more true to what Henry's saying, which is, yeah, we're going to fall. And sure, let's be afraid of that, sure, but not stop, not be paralyzed by that fear. And I think that's where Henry just delights me, that somewhere he could be paralyzed, he could stop, and he just kind of decides to carry on. That the hunger, and maybe to go with vulnerability and strength and these terms, maybe hunger and desire are the other terms, that somewhere in him there's a desire for something bigger. There's a hunger for connection, for meaning, for growth that just overrides the fear, and he's just going to walk through the fear and see whether he can meet that other desire.
Let's talk a little bit about Denny the paramedic. you talked about Henry's fear, and I can't imagine a more fearful moment than having a medical emergency away from home in a hotel. And then you, in great varying stages, come to understand that it's a heart attack. Was there an actual Denny? And if so or not, how did Denny come to be in the book?
So I knew that about 5 or 6 days before he died, Henry was on his way to Russia. He was going to do a film in front of the actual Prodigal Son painting, right? And he flew from Toronto overnight to Amsterdam, and he got out of the airport and he went to a hotel in Hilversum, and he started to be in pain, and he called the front desk, who came up and looked at him, and then called a medical emergency team. And they came, and because the stairs were too steep to take, needed to keep him flat. They couldn't take him down the stairs, and the elevators were too small, and they took him out a window. So that was sort of legendary. I knew that even that week before he died, like that went around the community, that, when God closes door, God opens a window. We thought it was pretty funny, because by the time, we thought he was going to be fine. It seemed very minor. And so that piece, I ran across a thing in his journal too, that 6 months earlier he'd written a little journal entry about defenestration, and that this was a new word for him. And so I kind of played with this defenestration idea and this whole idea of going out a window, but I couldn't figure out how anybody could be taken out a window in the middle of a heart attack and not die of a heart attack. I mean, I don't like heights, as I've said, but still, it seemed like how to add terror on terror, right? So I started to try to find out, how does this work? And I asked everyone I could, and then I started to look for, just Google search Dutch paramedics and things. And I ran across a guy who'd written, Denny Walterkins, who'd written an article in English about, I forget what it was, but it was related. And I reached out to him on LinkedIn and said, I want to learn about this. And he answered really graciously, and he said, I was training paramedics in exactly how to do this kind of window rescue in the 1990s. He got really excited. He went to Hilversum and looked at the hotel that Henry was taken out of. He tried to find who the paramedics were that answered the call, but it was too far away. He sent me a 15-page document with pictures of the truck that would have taken Henry out a window, because there only was one in the 1990s. So he sent me a picture of it. He sent me a picture of them in uniform. He sent me the whole protocol of what they would have asked, what equipment they used, what medication they would have given Henry. Like, he sent me every detail of how that rescue would have gone. Of that there would have been two, that the fire engine would have come, and an ambulance, and this, because once you get the lift, then the fire engine has to come with it. So there would have been 8, and they probably would have all been men, all surrounding him, and who would have gone upstairs, like just all these details. And so I named the character Denny. I mean, the lead nurse, I figured had to be named after this guy, Denny, who had been so helpful. In fact, Denny, he seems like such a nice guy. He got so involved in the story that he started to feel bad that he hadn't been able to help Henry more, even though actually he never met him. but he got so caught up with the story that he felt kind of wistful that he wished they could have done more. Yeah.
Amazing. The kindness of people willing to help on a project like this.
Yeah. It was so much fun. That this project had so many fun connections, and this was such a fun book to write.
What was it like to interact with the Flying Rodleys around this book?
It was great. I mean, Rodley and I are about the same age. I mean, somehow it hadn't really struck me till I started to think about it, that of course he was a lot younger than Henry. In fact, when I started working on the project, he was in Montreal, helping train Cirque du Soleil, and I thought, oh, great, I'll get to go meet him. And then a pandemic happened, and he went home to Australia with his wife, and he's across a very big ocean now. So I've never met him. But again, like Denny, he's been excited about the project. He's been in touch with all the surviving members, the Flying Rodleigh's troupe. They were all so excited that something was finally going to happen. We all started to miss Henri more and more as we worked on this project, as he revisited his memories. And yeah, it's and his descriptions of being a trapeze artist were also really interesting to me. One of the things I hadn't thought about was how you have to perform through injury. You just perform through whatever's going on or distractions. So when they heard Henri had died, they needed to practice, they needed to perform. And what he said was he kind of got through it by dedicating the performance to Henri. By feeling that Henri was present, that he was doing it for him. And then this really poignant, thing that as they took their final bow, he looked at the seat that Henri had sat in the last time he'd seen them perform, just 2 or 3 months before, and just wished the person sitting there was Henri. The book's full of lovable people.
Did Henry's friendship with the Flying Rodleighs, did it impact them in a deeper way? Like, did they get some of this sort of spiritual vulnerability and essence that the rest of us have come to know through Henry's work?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, one thing is that Rodleigh and his sister, who are part of the troupe, both of them, had grown up in a tradition. They had a sort of curious family tradition that was both circus performers, they're multi-generation of circus, but then also Seventh-day Adventists who really were uneasy about traveling circus life. Traveling circuses.
It's gritty. It's not always polished. It's
If you even think of that, as soon as the trapeze was invented
right.
by Jules Liotard, and the hit song of 1867 is the daring young man on the flying trapeze who takes away the narrator's love. Right? It's transgressive. It's it's loaded.
Right.
It's a bit too sexy. It's scary. So there's a way in which I think for Rodleighs to have Henri take their artistry seriously as not just beautiful art, but as spiritually important, kind of gave them a new way to think about what they were doing, about their own responsibility as artists, of the kind of work they were doing in the world. I think from what Rodleigh says, it made it feel even more big and meaningful and significant to them. And when you're giving your life to something in that way, it sure helps if other people recognize that this matters.
And it sounds like their relationship was trusting enough and intimate enough that Henri was willing to try the trapeze. Now, the way you describe him, I'm seeing something of a more nervous academic type. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but it doesn't seem to me that trying the trapeze would actually be something Henri would embrace, but he actually did.
Well, but think about him crawling around on the floor with my kids, or marching in Selma, or going to Latin America, or going, like in the book, when he goes to speak at HIV/AIDS conferences in the 90s when cases are skyrocketing. There's no cure in sight. And he says, yes, he'll speak. And then he says, no, he won't speak. And he says, yes and no and yes. Like it's deciding what we were talking about earlier, deciding to step through his fear and just do something, because the desire to be part of something, to discover something, is stronger than his fear somewhere.
And so
yeah, trying out the trapeze totally fits that.
We have video of Henri trying the trapeze. I know that's why everybody tuned in. So I'd love to share that video, and maybe if you could offer some more of your words from the book.
Do you want me to read the end of the book? I could read at
sure,
the very end, where he's kind of looking back.
Yeah, I think that would be right. So Parker, if we've got that video queued up, thank you.
I would say too, you're about to see Henri thrown off a pedestal. You know, if you've got Henri on a pedestal, just think as you watch this that maybe real friends lift you up and kick your feet out from under you and throw you off pedestals. Pedestals aren't somewhere to stay. Okay, here's the end of the book. Henri says, out of balance. Earlier in the spring, he'd confessed in his journal, quote, I feel quite anxious interiorly. I feel quite powerless in the face of free-floating emotions of love, hate, rejection, attraction, gratitude, regret. Not much is needed to bring that to the surface and throw me off balance. And then my words, Henri takes another breath. This is when he's being rescued during his heart attack, then lets it out with a sigh. Off balance indeed. Maybe those disturbing covered up emotions reveal that his life has been one off balance failure after another. He tries poking at some of his familiar insecurities, like prodding a sore tooth to see if it still hurts. What about that book he keeps promising the Rodleys? They're skilled, magnificent artists. They're bound to be disappointed whatever he writes. He tries another question, testing to see how tender it feels. Has his entire life been a pointless story of drifting from place to place like a hungry ghost? Does it look as pathetic as his efforts on the trapeze? He could imagine his life that way. It's like seeing himself in the video hanging limply before falling. But strapped on a stretcher now, his long-running fears are getting no traction. In fact, they seem almost comical. Henri remembers how his embarrassment over the sight of himself haplessly clutching the trapeze quickly turned to amusement in the presence of his cheerful friends. They chuckled watching the video. When Henri complained that the video showed that he had 2 left feet and only thumbs on his hands, their affectionate laughter increased. In their amusement was unconditional acceptance. As they chortled, Henri could not help laughing too, joining in the mirth, even as at his own expense. They did not judge his effort as sad. Also, he thinks, the sorry sight of his skinny body dangling from the trapeze was the view from the outside. His inner experience was dynamic. He did it. He climbed the swinging rope ladder. With the support of the troupe members, he reached out for the fly bar and launched off the pedestal. Even Rodley had been impressed by his utter fearlessness. Hanging for a few minutes, holding the catcher's hands, looking at John's upside down, smiling face was thrilling. No, pathetic would have been refusing that overwhelming physical desire to go to Selma and missing the experience of offering a ride to Charles and walking, singing, eating, and sleeping with fear and joy in that extraordinary community. Or staying in his mainly white enclave of people rather than going to be with Martin Luther King Jr.'s people at his funeral. Pathetic would have been staying at Harvard, getting more miserable and lonely by the day. It would have been pathetic to reject the invitation to join the Daybreak community, or to shy away from surprising friendships with Bill, Adam, and so many others, or to give in to his fear of rejection and not return to Daybreak after his emotional break, or be too afraid to go to the National Catholic HIV/AIDS ministry conferences. And truly pathetic would have been to stay seated in the bleachers at the circus, aching to meet the artists, but immobilized by his own self-consciousness.
Vulnerability, fear, those moments that speak to me anyway, when whether he's down on the floor with your kids playing and they're putting their fingers up his nose, or if he's flinging himself off the trapeze, or if he's walking to Selma, it almost feels like he's calling us to embrace these everyday opportunities that help us to truly live while being vulnerable. Is that a fair assessment in your view?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And he was very good at that.
Any other moments like that from his life that speak to you, that illustrate that willingness to be vulnerable and laugh at oneself, but also know that the consequences for not acting might deepen that inner turmoil?
Well, you know, when he goes to Daybreak, he has a huge emotional break, right? And I don't, I didn't know him at the time. But you could try to back away from something like that. And instead, he just goes with it and lets himself be transformed. Yeah. Now, I think at some point he has no choice. He really, when your whole heart and emotions just break, they do. So I'm not sure there's exactly a choice, but he also then walks into it, embraces it, tries to figure out what he has to learn from it, tries to figure out where he can grow, finds a new kind of solidarity with people with disabilities that he writes so compellingly that he finds a new relationship with this man Adam, who never spoke and needed care for almost everything, and that Henry had written about him and talked about him already, but suddenly when he has this break, he realizes that he is as helpless and in need, that he's not a caregiver. He needs to start receiving care in a different way, and it transforms his relationship with his L'Arche housemates when he returns. So that's another point at which he decides that he'll just walk into the experience and see what happens when he comes out the other side of it.
Is there something about L'Arche and this movement that we are building in the world together that helped him flesh that phenomenon out? What is that?
I feel like sending that question back to you, Matt. It might be a theological question.
To answer theological questions, I get around with kids on the floor.
That's right.
No, I mean, I think there's something about L'Arche reflects the effort of beloved community and is a reminder that we have to work at it. It doesn't just happen. I think that's the call of the gospel. I think that's the call of a Henri Nouwen. I think that's the call of L'Arche. And it's one of the fascinating things to me about Henry's life is that L'Arche, we sometimes refer to L'Arche as a school of life. And I think it was for even for a studied theologian like Henri Nouwen. And what does that say about the movement we're building that is L'Arche in the world? Why is that needed now?
I'm just going to loop back to this book and the trapeze too. That one of the things that interested me was, and again, as a literary scholar, that the Henry's big book that was just about to come out as he met the Flying Rodleys was The Return of the Prodigal Son, right? So he had spent 9 years just immersing himself in this painting and that gospel parable. And it's one of his best books, right? And when we read his book, we position ourselves in these ways of the prodigal son, on his knees in front of his father, of the older son trying to find his place in the family, of the father welcoming his son's home. And so as I thought about the trapeze and I thought about L'Arche and how the trapeze and L'Arche came together for Henry at that moment in 1991, when he sees the Flying Rodleys, I found myself thinking about the prodigal son image that he had been so immersed in. And what came to me was that what his book doesn't address is what you do when you get up from your knees, right? You're the prodigal son, you've groveled, you're up to the father, and the father says, get up, we're gonna have a party. And you become the father and you welcome people and you say, get up, we're gonna have a party. But once everybody gets up and they're on their feet, what's the act you're gonna do together now that you're not in a hierarchy, now that you're all sitting equal around a table? People with and without disabilities, people with, just once we're all on the same footing, what are we trying to do together? And it seems to me that is what, it made sense to me that's why an image of trapeze artists was Henry's next image after the return of the prodigal son, because it's what do we do together? What do we do in motion? What do we do that's dynamic in terms of failure and forgiveness? How does this keep how does this keep rolling forward for L'Arche? And I think L'Arche profoundly tries to live something there, but it's hard to get a grasp on an image of it. And I think the trapeze gave Henry this incredibly engaging, beautiful image of all the things of L'Arche, sort of ironically, with this beautiful, athletic, perfect bodies, doing a flawless act. You would not think this is the perfect expression of L'Arche, but I started to see why for Henry it was about that discipline of working together, of living something together, of traveling together, of forgiving each other, of talking about your failures, of expecting to fail. As he says, it's, risk and safety, it's discipline and freedom. It's, these sort of all these things all at once in this mesmerizing risk that you take, but not alone. Not alone. Yeah.
Folks, we do want to welcome your questions, whether you want to unmute and ask your question or type your question in the chat. Either way is fine, but now's the time to do it. We only have about 9 minutes left with Carolyn Whitney-Brown. I'm curious, are there any other hidden manuscripts of Henri Nouwen out there that we might know about? Maybe something else that could be an offer, or was this truly it?
Yeah. I don't know of anything more that's this substantial. I mean, there's certainly talks that have never been published and sermons, but often those were testing out things that later became books.
Right.
So I remember looking with a lot of interest at a talk he gave in the 60s about forgiveness and reconciliation, but a lot of that then becomes his first book, Intimacy. Like a lot of the unpublished stuff was working through things that gets published. As far as I know, this really is the last really substantial project that he saw as a book that he just didn't finish. And I think he didn't finish it because he ran out of time. I think he would have done something with it, but I think at the point when he died, even he didn't know what it was going to be.
Okay, I think we've got somebody who's got a question. Trying to find the raised hand here. My apologies. Oh, is it Alice? Yeah, welcome, Alice.
Thank you. I'm very intrigued by this whole conversation. I've personally been intrigued by the trapeze myself since I was a little girl. And I wanted to chat maybe a little bit about the metaphor of the catcher and the flyer, as the catcher being our Lord and we as the flyer. I had the amazing experience of going to Florida State University, where it's the only university I know of in the country that has a circus. And it's not one with lions and tigers and bears, oh my, but there is a trapeze. And I have a niece who joined the circus and became a flyer. And wow. When she was training to do that, what I learned from her is that you experience terrific pain in learning how to be the flyer. She would come home with her arms just covered in black and blue bruises.
Oh, wow.
And she was an athlete, so she was very strong and very athletic. But even with that, there were times where she was very tempted to give it up because it was so incredibly painful learning how to do it. So, I've thought a lot about that in terms of our relationship with the Lord and what it means to grow in our faith walks. And that, having raised two sons, both of whom were athletes and played on the football teams and all of that, and hearing them say, when I would see them bruised, they would say, well, Mom, no pain, no gain. It makes me realize that in our own walks, in order to grow, we too have to experience pain, but we experience it, as you were saying, in the community of others who are there for us, who support us, who help us along the way, who encourage us, who pick us up when we fall. And yes, there is the catcher who's always there to catch us, when we fall in life, in spirituality, when we fail miserably at being these things we call human beings, when we try our best to live as a disciple of Christ and fail miserably at that, how the catcher just picks us up and puts us back on that pedestal and says, fly again. So I'd like to chat a little bit more about that aspect of the trapeze.
Thank you, Alice. Great question.
Yeah, and I really like that you name that the flyer doesn't just fly once and get caught once. Because what Henri did publish in his lifetime and talked about quite a bit is this mesmerizing image of the, of trusting the catcher, that the flyer flies and just has to reach out and the catcher will catch them. And the flyer can't try to catch the catcher, or they can both break their wrists. And that certainly spoke to Henri as an image of our dying, of in the end, finally, we reach out and we trust the catcher and just go and trust. But within life, which is what Henri was working on a lot, what that image means in our lives, which is what I'm really glad you brought that out, because the catcher doesn't catch the flyer and stop in midair. The catcher catches the flyer and either sends them on to something else, kind of gets their momentum going again, or sends them back up to the pedestal to start their next routine. There's never, it's about the catcher helping us get our momentum going again. And symbolically as God, we fly, we trust, and God catches us and gives us momentum for the next thing. Gives us a direction, gives us energy. The pain part is so interesting. Like I was saying, Rodley talked about that, of how, performing through pain, both physical and emotional pain, performing.
Right.
Just a few weeks ago, he had knee replacements, your body, it's hard work on your body. He's not a flyer anymore, but he's training people, and the years of being a flyer takes a toll. So yeah, what does that mean? That we, Henri, like I was saying about his emotional break, somewhere he decided that the pain he was in emotionally, that he would walk through it and just go into it and see. And yeah, I think, like, when I had to correct myself, that he never says and not be afraid to fall. He says, even when we're afraid of falling, even when we are afraid of our pain, we do what we're called to do. We do what we long to do. Maybe it's around hunger and desire for God, that we keep trusting and trying the next thing. But that question of pain is big, because I also don't think God gratuitously wants us to have pain.
Right.
But we live in a world that's complicated, and in relationships where we will hurt each other. And yeah.
Well, and we live in a world that calls us to deeper vulnerability with one another as being the answer to get through some of life's pain, to the point of much of Henri's work.
Yeah, and to the discipline of boundaries, of vulnerability,
sure.
with some clarity of doing something together for a purpose. When Henri talked about vulnerability or being a wounded healer, he wasn't talking about just randomly dumping our woundedness out there. It was about working with it and then being able to share with others how we were working to heal that, how we were working to what our experience was of living through our pain for greater solidarity. Yeah.
This is the book. It is a fantastically fun read, especially if you are a friend or a fan of Henri Nouwen, from HarperCollins. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Matt. Yeah, it's a kind of nice, pretty Christmas colors.
Yeah, that time of year. So
Yeah.
we're so grateful for your time and for being just a champion of L'Arche and for bringing us this book. Thank you so very much for it.
Well, thanks for letting me talk about it.
Of course.
It's really a joy.
Everyone have a good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Matt with L'Arche and so happy that you could be with us. Have a good night.
Thanks.